Marilyn, the question of angels, demons, perfuse public consciousness. Most people, certainly in America, believe in these things, and they bring snickers to the lips of my scientific friends. But if we look at religion, history of religion, philosophies, aspects of parapsychology, things like possession, poltergeists, hierarchies of angels, perfuse human experience. I want to come to you as someone who is familiar with all of these traditions and ways of thinking to ask me how should I begin to approach this awkward subject?
Well, it's a complex one, and clearly there's no easy answers, in terms of the ontology of do angels or do demons actually exist. I don't think that there are any clear answers to that. What it appears to be, in terms of looking cross-culturally and historically, is our meaning-making construction of the polarity between good and evil. And so within each of us, there are these different forces that sort of wage war, as it were. And we have this impulse toward good and the social right, and then this impulse toward these kind of self-destructive activities or other destructive activities. And I think a big part of socialization is bringing these kind of impulses within ourselves into balance. So in a cultural framework where you're trying to then put a meaning system on that, it's easy to then ascribe a kind of personality to it. So there's these little figures with horns that are running around in the forest and creating bad impulses within us, or these kind of angelic creatures that guide us and help us to navigate through the turmoil. So I would say, that you could, at the very least, begin to think about it in psychological terms as a way of engaging the complexities in ourselves.
Certainly that makes sense, and I think there's some cultural aspects as well. So we deal with psychological and cultural, but if we push that further, and at least ask what have the different subsets of humanity thought about this, I think we would both agree that a large number of certainly the major religions of today would have angels and demons of different descriptions as part of their true ontology, as really existing creatures. Would you correct?
No question, and as we can see by simply looking at all of the different worldviews that exist simultaneously, some seem to be more supported by empirical data than others. Some are more faith-based, and you just have to ascribe meaning and reality to those without any sort of evidence.
But there's a commonality among religions that they all seem to have these
There very
creatures.
Definitely is, and I think there's a commonality across our humanness to how we story our own intersubjective conflicts.
Yeah, and the question is whether those angels and demons and all the religions are just metaphorical and expressive personifications of our internal conflicts, and therefore more metaphor than reality, or is indeed there some true external reality, which, of course, all of the religions would claim.
Well, certainly if you look at this notion of archetypes, it could be that there are kind of fields of evil or fields of good, and they may take forms. I don't dismiss the idea that people from indigenous cultures who believe that there are treacherous spirits out there, or that the cause of illness is some kind of possession from an evil spirit. I think that
You won't dismiss that.
No, I don't. I think that model works within a coherent system. How I would then provide a kind of analytical explanation for it is really, I used to know a guy who had tattoos all over his body, and one night he was in a particular state of discomfort, and he was warring with himself. And on one side he had tattoos that represented the virtues of his own capacity, and on the other were the demonic forces. And I would say, watching him that night, the demon was winning out. And so do I say, was he really possessed? Well, he was possessed with darkness. There's no question about it. Whether that can be sort of reduced to his own, substrate of brain, mind, culture. Certainly, he was acting it out and embodying it in his own, worldview.
I won't ask about any of your other friends. That's okay.
Well, I'll count you. How about your tattoos, Robert?
What about in the parapsychological world? I've occasionally read where one looks to real creatures, poltergeists, possessions, manifestations of UFOs. What has been the background?
Well, most cultures have a belief in things like reincarnation or survival of consciousness. Most cultures have some kind of cosmology for understanding what happens when we die. And for many of those cultures, it's a parallel world. You look at the Hispanic model, and the Day of the Dead, for example. What happens in the Day of the Dead is the idea that you actually want to create situations for the spirit world that are parallel to the world we live in here. So, if a person was a hairdresser, they may still be a hairdresser. If they smoked cigarettes, they may still smoke cigarettes. So what you want to do is provide offerings to appease the spirit. We talk about Halloween as the time when it is this period of a semi-permeable membrane between the living and the dead. Well, most cultures have a model like that would allow us to engage and in some ways to appease the dark forces that could pull us onto the other side. And in many cases, it's honoring the dead. In the case of Tibetan Buddhism, you see that reincarnation is an important piece of it, and that by living, you're actually working out your issues, and it may take you several lifetimes to do that. But ultimately, there's this sense of an intact consciousness that is independent of its bodily form. Are these views right or wrong? We don't know. It certainly doesn't fit within the materialist model of Western society.
And I know you appreciate the cultural significance of these traditions, but the next question is, do you give any credence whatsoever to even the possibility that there may be some real antecedent to these beliefs?
I hold open the possibility that most things can be true, and that as we try to get closer to truth, that we can begin to understand what's true for us, what has meaning for us. I think that as we begin to look at the forces in society, we can clearly see that there is a tension between the forces of good and evil, and that as we can begin to become more conscious of ways to enhance the good within ourselves, that we, without denouncing the dark sides of ourselves. I think, the whole notion of, the shadow culture is something that needs to be owned rather than pushing it under the rug, to say we have these impulses that sometimes aren't the most generous, sometimes aren't the most socially redeeming. And then by being honest about those things, by embracing the demons, as it were, as part of ourselves, that it's less risky in that sense, because we become more whole and we can allow the positive aspects of our consciousness to sort of overpower the darker impulses. So in terms of the nature of angels and demons, I think it's really an open question, but it really depends on what is the cosmology that is most satisfying to a particular culture, to a particular time in history.